In the next chapter, we'll discuss operators. Operators are the most basic way we act on variables. Some of the basic operators are mathematical, things like addition and subtraction. So let's talk briefly about the interaction between types and operators. For example, what happens when we try to multiply two variables with different types? Well, that's what this code right here tries to show. On lines 1, 2, 3, and 4, we create 4 different variables. 2 of them are integers called my number 1 and my number 2, and they have the values 5 and 3. The third is a string with the value hello world, and the fourth is a float called my float with a value 5.1. Now before we move on, we can just look at these variables and decide which operations are going to make sense. Does it make sense to add 5 and 3? Well, yeah, the answer is 8. Does it make sense to subtract them? 5 minus 3 is 2. We can do most of our mathematical operators when we have two numbers. And we might be able to combine those numbers with that floating point number down here as well. 3 times 5.1 would be 15.3. 5.1 minus 3 would be 2.1, and so on. So on line 5, we see one of these successful interactions in action. We multiply my number 1 by my number 2, that's 5 times 3, and we print the result, which is 15. Not too surprising. 5 times 3 is 15, and so we're saying to print 15. Line 6 says something strange though. It says to multiply my float, which is 5.1, by my string, which is hello world. What's 5.1 times hello world? That is like asking what blue times cabbage is. That just doesn't make any sense. And as we see, when we try to do this operation, we get this error over here. It says that on line 6, we have a type error because we can't multiply a sequence by the type float. In this case, sequence is the word that Python is using to describe this string because a string is a sequence of characters. And it's saying that we can't multiply a sequence of characters by a float. And it makes sense that this would generate an error because we can't even think about what 5.1 times hello world would be. So a type error in this context means that the data types we're using aren't compatible with whatever mathematical operation we're using in the middle. Python has some unexpected operators though. For example, notice in this error message that it says we can't multiply a sequence by a non-int of type float. The fact that Python specifies non-int suggests that maybe we can multiply a sequence by an integer. What would that be? Well, let's try it out and see. Here we've taken away 2 of the variables because we don't need them anymore, but we're still creating an integer and a string. And we're trying to print the result of multiplying the string by the integer. My string times my number 1, or hello world, times 5. When we run that line, Python doesn't give us an error. In fact, it just takes that string and repeats it however many times we multiplied it by. So we multiplied hello world by 5, so it prints hello world 5 times. There's no line break, it just breaks the line because I ran out of room over here. So this is one of the strange things that Python does. And it's a good example of how it can pay to just play around with a language and see what happens. To be completely honest, I only discovered that this operator works this way when trying to write some code that generates an error. As we play around though, we'll find that there are a lot of things we still can't do. For example, we can't multiply a string by a string. In this code, we create 2 strings and try to multiply them together. And again, we get our type error. What's hello world times world hello? I don't know. So play around with data types, play around with operators, and see which ones give you combinations that actually will work. We'll also talk more about this when we get to operators in earnest.